food prices soon soar, as does Tibetan resentment. The Chinese troops soon stretched Tibet's fragile economy to the point of collapse, and the Tibetan people are now on the verge of famine and starvation. At first, the Chinese communists behave well, and the troops have strict instructions to be on their best behavior and not to alienate or intimidate the local population. But the Tibetan children throw stones at the Red Army, adults spit at them, and the monks even tie knots in their shawls and smack the troops as they ride by. The Chinese communists at first turn the other cheek, but gradually they abandon this method as low morale begins to sink in. The Chinese communists consider the Tibetans barbarians, and they wish to bring them into the 20th century. But their reforms are met with obstruction at every turn. By 1955, a new method is utilized by the Chinese. Marxism must be made to replace Buddhism in the daily lives of the Tibetan people. And a slew of anti-religious, anti-Buddhist propaganda soon starts up. Even the Buddha himself is denounced by the Chinese communists as a reactionary puppet. This Chinese anti-religion propaganda attack is essentially the greatest possible nightmare for the Tibetan people. The nightmare of the destruction of their religion and the destruction of their way of life. This ancient fear or national phobia that had driven the Tibetans to turn their backs on the rest of the world, closing its borders for centuries, now rises up to the surface. Tibetans, their hostility turns to hatred, and armed resistance begins to spread, especially in eastern Tibet, mostly by the fiercely independent and warlike Khamba tribesmen. The Chinese, their supply columns are attacked, the roads and bridges are destroyed, and the Red Army communists strike back and demolish thousands of monasteries with endless rounds of artillery shells. Sacred buildings, monuments, and, priceless works of art are desecrated and destroyed. The monks are subjected to public humiliation and are also forced to work on construction projects. Well, the result of all this nastiness is that more Tibetans join the guerrilla fighters, and resistance gradually spreads. The Chinese communists try to crush the Tibetan spirit by means of harsh and unjust sentences, executions, and deportations to Peking. Little of these tragic events actually reach the outside world. But some rumors manage to filter into India. By the fall of 1958, reports begin to reach India that a full-scale anti-communist rebellion is in full swing in Tibet. The bloody, dramatic, and sad climax of this Tibetan rebellion comes in March 1959, as rumors that the Chinese plan to kidnap the young Dalai Lama ignite insurrection in the holy city. The Dalai Lama was invited to attend a theatrical performance, but he was asked to leave his bodyguard and ministers behind. The people, both frightened and angry as hell, begin to converge on the palace. 12 days of fighting then begins, a battle that will leave the streets of the holy city drowning in Tibetan blood. The young God King is virtually torn up within himself. He is a devout believer in nonviolence. And he has managed for 9 years to maintain an uneasy coexistence with the communist Chinese invaders. The young Dalai Lama now realizes that the inevitable showdown is happening as 30,000 Tibetans refuse to leave the palace grounds. Tibetan army units soon join the crowd, bringing with them extra weapons, guns that have been hidden for years in homes and monasteries. Defensive positions are established, and Tibetan guards now patrol the walls. The Tibetans proclaim themselves independent and no longer recognize Chinese authority over them. They demand that the communists withdraw their troops and go home. The Dalai Lama still hopes to prevent bloodshed and sends a message to the rebel leaders to not aggravate the already explosive situation. This moderate stance by the teenage God King has been criticized by some Tibetans. They feel that more forceful leadership was needed during this time of war and national crisis. In the Dalai Lama's letters from the period, from this time, he disowns the rebels and professes friendship with the Chinese. These letters were aimed at, diffusing a very dangerous situation, and the letters are an attempt to buy the Tibetans some precious time. A tense stalemate, a Mexican standoff follows. This Mexican standoff lasts several days. The Chinese Red Army is waiting for instructions from Peking, and the anger of the rebels does not simmer down. Tibetan officials are attacked by the crowds. Some are seized and lynched as collaborators. This stalemate continues until March 16th, when the Chinese bring up artillery within point-blank range of the holy city, and Chinese reinforcements arrive by air. The Tibetans around the palace are, now ready to defend the Dalai Lama and the holy city with their lives. 2 Chinese mortar shells then fly into the grounds of the palace. They do little damage, but cause much fear and loathing amongst the Tibetans. Pressed by his ministers and close advisors, the Dalai Lama agrees to escape from the holy city under cover of the night. A 13-day odyssey to find asylum in India now begins. The young God King clutches a rifle and dresses up as a Kamba gorilla and slips through the gates of the palace. His mother, sister, and younger brother are also dressed as soldiers, and they all hurry south towards India. The Dalai Lama has been often criticized for abandoning the holy city and fleeing with his family to safety in India. Personally, I feel a leader should stay with his people, even if it means his death. But we should not judge the Dalai Lama very harshly. It was a difficult decision to make. We also have to remember he's very, very young. Even under the best conditions, it's never easy to rule. Now, the Chinese communists soon discover that he has escaped, give warning to the Tibetans, and then begin to shell the palace. The Tibetans are in no mood to surrender, and the bombardment of artillery shells begin. The mortar fire causes many casualties among the Tibetan defenders, since few of them are dug in. But they all refuse to run or to surrender and vow to fight to the bitter end. The Tibetans put up a fierce resistance, and the enraged populace attack the Chinese army. They are armed with some of them are only armed with sticks and stones, and the Tibetan women fight and die as bravely as the men do. The Chinese Red Army are experienced, seasoned soldiers. They have fought in World War II. They have also fought in a civil war after World War II. So they know what they're doing. They also have tanks and artillery, superior weapons and tactics. And the Tibetan insurrection is doomed from the start. After 3 days of desperate and hopeless fighting, thousands of Tibetans' bodies litter the grounds and walls of the palace, and the holy city. The Tibetans believed that their gods would protect them and ensure their victory, but the uprising is bloodily crushed by the Chinese Communist Red Army. A long period of political and religious oppression follows the Tibetan rebellion. The Chinese communists set about once and for all to destroy the power of the monasteries and noble families of Tibet. They demolish, close, and sack the monasteries and confiscate the land and wealth of the nobles. The monks are now forced to marry, settle on the land, or face starvation. Temples and shrines are stripped of their sacred images, and ancient Buddhist scriptures are burned to a crisp. Identity cards are introduced, and freedom of movement is curtailed. There's executions, there's beatings, there's public denunciations as the Chinese communists run amok. Thousands are arrested and deported to communist China. And Marxist political indoctrination in the way of compulsory daily meetings becomes the new law of the land. Tibetans are forced to abandon their old Buddhist faith. They are forced to embrace Karl Marx and Chairman Mao, face very dire consequences. Tens of thousands of Tibetans react against the Chinese communist oppression the only